Okay, so you've learned how to present the blue brochure, the agency disclosure, as well as the buyer's representation agreement. Now it's time to get into the meat and potatoes of contract writing, the RE21 purchase and sale agreement. So what I'm gonna do in this video is I'm gonna go through all of the terms, give you definitions, kind of explain exactly what these things mean, so that you're able to explain them when and if you are asked about them by your clients. And then we'll do a follow-up video with a much more efficient run-through so that you can present the contract as a whole in an efficient, maybe 5-6 minute presentation with your clients. Kind of hit the key points, and then if they have any additional questions, then you can address those on an individual basis. So the beginning section of the RE21, lines 1 through 5, pretty much just defines the brokerages that are involved. But there is also a section there for the ID number. Now, a lot of newer agents will put the MLS number in there. It's not a great practice, just because if 2 or 3 agents are making offers on the same property and they're all using the MLS number as the ID, it can make it really difficult for the brokers to keep track of which contract is which. So what I personally do is I take the last name of my clients. So for example, let's say my client is, her name's Joanne Gonzalez, and she's buying 26714 Walker Road. Then my contract ID is going to be Gonzalez 26714. That just kind of separates it from any other offers that might be on the table, unless, you know, in the unlikely event there's another Gonzalez that is putting in an offer and they also use that same ID system. So just make sure that you get all this information filled out correctly on top, just so that the title company is able to reach out to you. Make sure that it isn't your broker's phone number in the section for your number, because title, the loan officers might need to reach out to you, or they likely will, and you're going to want to have all of that information be correct. Item number 1 is the buyer, and it identifies the buyer, and it also identifies the property. So it business calls. 1 second. Duty calls. Okay, so back to section 2 here. So you have the purchase price, and then you also have, there's this section directly, actually let's back up. So section number 1, you're going to have the purchaser. Make sure that you get their full legal name. That's going to make things easier for title, especially because they're going to have to show their driver's license at the closing table. So get their full legal name. You know, a lot of people that go by Bill, you know, their name is William, and you want things to match. Also, you're going to put the commonly known address as well as the legal description. I'm sure you'll remember from real estate school, a contract is not valid unless it has an enforceable legal description. So make sure that you're not just taking the legal description from a prior MLS listing. Actually go to the assessor's website and find that legal description. If the legal description is lengthy, then you can attach it as an additional exhibit. Those are pretty rare, kind of few and far between. I've personally dealt with that a few times in my career, but it's not all that common. Section 2 is going to be the purchase price, and what often gets missed is the item in bold underneath the purchase price, which says this offer is contingent upon the sale, refinance, or closing of any other property. A lot of agents leave that blank. It's a really important thing for the listing agent to know, and for the seller to know if you're bringing an offer or if you're receiving an offer. It's important for you to know, hey, is this offer going to be contingent upon the sale of another house? You know, that's going to really affect the terms of that offer, especially if you're dealing with a multiple offer situation. Earnest money. You know, earnest money, that is, as I'm sure you're aware, a contract to be legal and enforceable in the state of Idaho, it does have to have what's called consideration, also known as funds or something of value that is put up on behalf of that contract. And I always like to explain to my clients, my goal is to protect your best interests. My goal is to make sure that you don't lose your earnest money. And so I'm going to let you guys know throughout the steps, hey, at this point, the earnest money is forfeit unless X, Y, or Z happens. And then as you get past the appraisal, it's like, okay, look, at this point, once that appraisal comes in, the earnest money, you guys will not be able to back out of this contract without forfeiting that earnest money. So here at Real Broker, we don't hold the funds, so you're going to want to have that, you're going to, on where it says held by, you're going to want to put the closing company, and then that's going to be held by whichever title company you guys open title at for this transaction. You can take cash, personal check. Try not to take cashier's checks, and wire transfers. Really, you only want to do that if it's an out-of-state buyer, and even then, really make sure that they have the proper account and routing number, because wire fraud is definitely a risk these days. Also, on delivered, it says within blank business days. We generally do within 3 business days of acceptance. That just gives us time for the buyer to go and get a check. Not many people have checks anymore, so they're probably going to have to go to their bank and actually print out some checks, and that can, that can take a few days. So, but this is just a best practice thing here, where it says after business days, it says in parentheses 3 if left blank. Fill out these things. Don't leave them blank and just rely on it on the default. It's really unprofessional. Whenever I get offers and it's just full of blanks, it's frustrating because I have to go and then read the parentheses and be like, okay, how many days do they have? And it's frustrating for the transaction coordinators and the title company. So fill in the blanks, please. And then as far as deposit, I like to do upon receipt and acceptance. You don't want to have to deliver earnest money to title before the contract is accepted. And in this way, you can oftentimes just have your client just take the earnest money straight to title, which will save you some trouble. The responsible broker shall be, that's going to be the broker. If you're representing the buyer, you're going to want that to be the broker that is your broker, because if there is an earnest money dispute, it would be in your best interest and in your client's best interest to have the responsible broker be their broker, rather than it be the seller's broker. Whether or not it's an all cash offer, select the box that is appropriate. Sometimes agents will leave this blank. Again, that just kind of comes down to professionalism. If it is an all cash offer, make sure that you explain to your clients that they are going to need to provide you proof of funds within this time frame. If you leave it blank, which you shouldn't do, that's 5 business days. But just explain to them, hey, I'm going to need a statement, whether it's from your retirement account or wherever you're going to be pulling these funds. You can black out the account numbers, but it does need to have your name, and it does need to show that those funds are available for withdrawal. Section C on item 3 is cash proceeds are coming from another sale, yes or no. Make sure that you check that. It says no if left blank, but make sure that you put that in there. And then new loan proceeds, when you're filling this out, you're going to want to rely on the terms that are in your buyer's pre-qualification letter. And you are going to put in the section that says first loan. That's where you're going to type in the amount of their first. If they have a second, you'll put that in the second. And then Instinet or Authentisign will automatically add these up for you. So that is kind of handy, and it will also funnel down to the total funds due at closing. And so you want to make sure that that is all lining up, and make sure that you're putting the actual terms that are on the pre-qualification letter. I've been on the phone with loan officers that are like, yeah, just put that they're putting 20% down. They're only going to probably put 10% down, but put in there that it's going to be 20, makes the offer stronger. but it also makes the offer dishonest. So don't do that. Make sure that you're putting the actual terms, because that's going to affect the seller. It can affect the seller in a really negative way, especially if, for instance, the appraisal comes in under value. Then that could become a factor, and you don't want to have inaccurate information on this contract, not by any stretch. Put what type of financing they're doing, what their interest rate's going to be, whether it's fixed or variable, and for how long. And then also on line 40 here, the loan application buyer has applied for, shall apply for financing within X number of days. As a good general rule of practice, I try not to be out showing property to people on a regular basis that don't have a pre-qualification letter, that haven't applied yet. So make sure that you get those pre-qualification letters. I always like to give people one. I'll be like, yeah, I'll go out and show you this house. But if they want to continue looking at properties, I'm going to request that they get a pre-qualification letter from a loan officer. This section also, there is in bold here, it says that the buyer agrees to furnish seller with a written confirmation showing lender approval of credit report, income verification, debt ratios, and evidence of sufficient funds and or proceeds necessary to close transaction in a manner acceptable to the sellers and subject only to satisfactory appraisal and final lender underwriting. If an appraisal is required by the lender, the property must appraise at not less than the purchase price, or the buyer's earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. So there at the end of this section on the next page, it goes into some FHA and VA terms, but this section basically says that the buyer is going to within X number of days be clear to close, subject only to final underwriting and the appraisal. Give yourself plenty of time on this, because the seller, if you don't have final approval, then the seller can say, hey, you didn't give us notice that the buyer is clear to close, subject to only these items, and they can actually kick your offer. So make sure that you give yourself plenty of time. I would say if you're going to be doing a 30-day escrow, a 15 business day period of time is sufficient. The FHA and VA on page 2 section, it basically it outlines some of the terms. With an FHA or a VA loan, the property has to appraise at value. It also has to with a conventional loan. However, with a conventional loan, if it doesn't appraise, then the buyer has the option to bring additional funds. If that's happening on a VA loan in particular, then the VA does have to give express permission that they are allowing the buyer to bring additional funds and pay more than the appraised value. So something to kind of keep in mind. Additional financial terms. This is section E that you're not really going to use that often. We used to use this quite a bit, but then they added a section later on in the contract that kind of eliminated that need. This is where we used to ask for assistance with closing costs and things like that, but there's a section for that. It's unlikely that you're going to be needing that. The only situation where that might happen or come into play is if you're going to be doing an owner carry where the owner is acting as the bank, but there actually is a separate contract for that, and it's the second box in section E. It says additional financial terms are contained in a financing addendum of same date attached here to and signed by both parties. So you're really not going to need that first box. Like I said, Instanet is automatically going to total up section F to show the approximate funds that are going to be due from the buyers at closing. Now, this does not include closing costs, so I always like to let my clients know that when we're going through an offer, that they're like, oh wow, we only have to bring $7,000 to close. Our lender said it would be more, and I always have to remind them, hey, this does not include closing costs. So this is just for the principal of the loan. So add in whatever your loan officer is stating for closing costs, and that's going to be your actual amount that is going to be due at closing. So down here underneath that, it says if such written confirmation required in 3B or 3D, those are the sections that stated that they would get final approval within X number of days. If written confirmation is not received by the seller within the strict time allotted, then the sellers may at their option cancel the agreement by notifying the buyer in writing of such cancellation within X number of days. I always like to give them the shortest amount of time possible, so I put 1 business day generally. Just it makes it so that they don't have that loophole to get out of the contract. It's a best practice for protecting your client's best interests. Okay, section 4, satisfaction and or removal of all contract contingencies. So this basically just states that no contingencies can go past the date that you're going to specify here. Usually I like to do like 3 days, or maybe 48 hours if we're in a very tight time frame. But the seller is going to want that period of time to be as long as possible, because once you come to this time frame outlined in section 4, there are no contingencies that can be exercised that can get the buyer their earnest money back. So you want to make sure that you give yourself a little bit of time, because you might come down to the wire and have 48 hours prior to closing, and the appraisal finally comes in, and so you want to give yourself some time on that. Other terms and conditions, be really cautious with this section, because you're going to just make sure that you're very specific with other terms and conditions. If the buyer is wanting the Frigidaire refrigerator that's in the garage at the time of their initial showing, you're going to want to outline that pretty specifically. Frigidaire washer at time of showing to be included in the sale as part of the sale at no additional cost to buyer. Just be specific with those additional terms. Items included and excluded in the sale. You can also do additional items specifically included. This is where you could put that, washer, dryer, refrigerator, things like that. Or if there's say a riding lawnmower, if there's a decent amount of property and the buyer wants that, this is a good section to ask for those kinds of things. Back to that other terms and conditions, this is a good place to put, let's say you go and you do a showing and they like the house, but the carpets are just a mess. You can put in here, and again, be really specific. Item 1, seller to have professional carpet cleaners clean carpet no more than 48 hours prior to close, and provide receipt to seller, or provide receipt to the buyer. That way you know that it was done professionally, and you're going to have a receipt of that work having been done. On to page 3, mineral rights. Basically, a lot of this page, or of these next sections, are kind of boilerplate contract language here. But any and all mineral rights pertinent to the property and owned by the seller are included and are part of the sale. But this is not going to be of particular interest unless you're selling a property with a lot of acreage where they have mining rights and things like that. Water rights, the same. Unless you're, this basically, if let's say you're selling a property where they have their ownership extends into a section of a river or a creek, those rights are going to transfer on to the new owner unless expressly stated otherwise. Farm crops, timber rights, pretty much same thing, boilerplate. Title conveyance, so title is going to be transferred by the seller in the form of a warranty deed. And the title company is going to do what they call a preliminary title search, a preliminary title commitment. They're gonna do kind of a cursory examination of the title to make sure that there's no liens or encumbrances that they didn't know about. Common ones are going to be a mortgage lien. What they're really looking for are liens from contractors, like a contractor's lien. That's going to be something that's going to be kind of a red flag. Also, I've seen any number of crazy things on a title report. Probably the craziest one was a child support lien, where the person that was owed the child support owed the home, but at the time of after they got divorced, he was still on the title of the house, and he wasn't removed until later, and he didn't pay child support, and so there was this massive lien on the house. So make sure that you are going through those title commitments. You're going to look for a section called exceptions. Go through those. It's almost at the end of the preliminary title commitment. Just look through that. But back to this section, title conveyance. This just says that the seller will be conveying via a warranty deed that's free of any unknown encumbrances, liens, etc. Title insurance. So there's a couple of different types of title insurance. There's going to be the standard title insurance policy that is paid for generally by the seller. There's a mortgagee policy that is paid for by the buyer, and then there's additional title coverage. I generally always put on my contracts that my buyers are going to be getting that additional coverage. Every brokerage or every title company calls it something different. You know, an Eagle policy or something, the premium policy. But it's a good idea to have that. Excuse me. So preliminary title commitment and CC&Rs. If you're representing the buyer, put that the seller is going to be furnishing a preliminary title commitment to the buyer. It just puts the ball in their court. And make sure that when you receive that title commitment that you get a copy of that and a copy of the CC&Rs over to the buyer. If you have a transaction coordinator, make sure that they have verbiage in their email that states, this is your responsibility to look through these CC&Rs and this title commitment, and it is vitally important. If you need help, please refer to your escrow officer. That is going to free you of any liability if there later on down the road there is a dispute over the CC&Rs. The buyer decides that they didn't like the CC&Rs, or the HOA decides to enforce some CC&Rs that the buyer doesn't like. They might try to sue you for that. So make sure that when you deliver those CC&Rs that you state to them, it's your responsibility to review these, and if you have any questions about these, to reach out to your escrow or title officer. Title company, per RESPA, this is a buyer's decision. The buyer has the right to choose the title company. So I always like to throw out a couple of options, you know, of title companies that I trust. But let them know it is your decision. If you guys have a preference, that's who we'll use. The next two sections just go over a little bit more in depth the standard coverage owner's policy versus the mortgagee policy. Jumping down to section 12, the inspection. So the inspection time frame, you want to make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to do the inspection, get the results back, convey those results, and go over those results with your client, and then get any necessary bids for repairs or any additional inspections that might be done. Maybe the home inspector says the roof needs a roof certification because it looks like it's at the end of its life. Make sure that you give yourself enough time. A lot of agents will put 5 business days. I find that that's just not really substantial enough time. I would say 7 business days is going to be more preferable. And the very first part in bold here, under section 12, it says buyer chooses to conduct inspections or not to conduct inspections. In the event that your buyer chooses not to conduct inspections, get it in writing from them, separate from this. An email will suffice, just that states, you know, I would send your client an email that says, hey, just wanted to confirm per our conversation or per your instructions that you are choosing not to have a home inspection against my counsel. Always counsel your clients to get a home inspection, and get it in writing that they chose to go against your counsel if they choose not to have one. And then again, time frames for the inspections. The first primary inspection time frame is just the amount of time that you're going to give yourself to do your due diligence and then get notice to the seller of any items that you want fixed. There's a secondary inspection section. This particularly has to do with wells or septic tanks or surveys. So not altogether common, but then again not altogether rare. So just make sure that you're giving yourself enough time. Well inspections can take a little bit of time because they have to take a sample, they have to send the sample to the lab and run diagnostics. It can take some time. A septic inspection and pumping or a survey, these things can take time. So make sure that you're calling these companies and finding out, hey, how far out are you guys? What's a reasonable time frame? And then ask for that reasonable time frame in the contract. Section C, satisfaction or removal of the inspection contingencies. So if your buyer does not get the seller notice in writing, then they are going to have, the assumption is that they're moving forward with the contract, and it's not just an assumption, it's a legal assumption. Buyer is agreeing that they are committing to moving forward without asking for any repairs and without exercising their right to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. So let your folks know if they are like, we don't want any repairs. Let them know, hey, by not submitting anything, we are our earnest money is going to be much more difficult to get returned to you if you don't follow through with the transaction. But most of the time you are going to find some items that need to be repaired, even on a brand new construction house. So this section here, if buyer does give the seller written notice of termination, the parties have no obligation to continue and the buyer gets their earnest money back. If the buyer does give written notice of disapproved items, then the seller shall have a certain time frame to review that and get bids on those repairs and then get back to the buyer. Most of the time 3 days is actually gonna suffice on that. If the seller does not agree to do those repairs, or if they just straight up don't respond, then the buyer has the option of negotiating disapproved items stated in that particular buyer's notice, or giving the seller written notice of termination. So basically, just if they don't respond, or if they say no, we're not doing any of the repairs, then the buyer does have the option to go ahead and terminate and get their earnest money back. There is a section here, home warranty programs are available for purchase. I don't know why that's in the contract. It seems unnecessary, but it's there. Lead paint disclosure, if a property was built in 1978 or before, then that is what is referred to as target housing for having the risk of lead-based paint. Make sure if it is target housing that you are getting the lead-based paint disclosure. It's a very lengthy disclosure. Don't print it out. It's really lengthy and it's a waste of paper. In my opinion, it's a waste of paper. Maybe you don't think it's a waste, but get it over to your clients. I always send it over digitally through DocuSign, and the reason that I like to do that is because I'll put initials on page 1. That way they have to initial that they've received that. And then there's also a lead-based paint disclosure if the property is target housing. That should be available on the MLS. The listing agent should have uploaded that, and so you'll want to get a copy of that. Get a copy of that to your buyer as well, and get their signatures on that. Okay. Now, if the property is target housing and your buyer decides not to waive their, if they choose to test for lead-based paint, there is a section in here that says that the buyer waives or does not waive the right that if the test results show unacceptable amounts of lead-based paint, and that if the contract is canceled under that clause, that the buyer's earnest money shall be returned to them. So there's been some confusion over this in the past, even amongst well-seasoned agents. But basically, what this means, this waives or does not waive, what that means is that if they cancel due to lead-based paint, they can get their earnest money back or not. So it's an interesting thing to even have it be an option. It seems like they should have just said if it's not a satisfactory level of lead-based paint, if there's a lot of lead-based paint in the house and they want to cancel, they can do so and get their earnest money back. I don't know why any buyer would waive that right. So just don't let your client waive that right. Okay, the mold disclaimer. This one basically just states that mold is a naturally occurring microorganism, and it's a risk and a part of home ownership. And that if mold is discovered on the property after closing, whether it be 6 months down the road or 5 years down the road, that the buyer holds harmless any and all parties involved in the transaction, because mold can arise at any time with just trace amounts of humidity. Mold can show up in the attic. In fact, in your real estate career, you're going to encounter mold way more than you probably ever thought that you would. But we're in Idaho, and it's a wet place, and so mold is pretty common. It can be a good idea to kind of prepare your clients for that as well by letting them know that mold is quite common and it's quite easily remediated. And as long as you're, there are some companies that are out there that charge an arm and a leg to remediate mold. There's a lot of companies out there that that can do it at a pretty reasonable rate, depending on the extent of the mold. But I just recently got a bid for $1,800 to remediate some mold that was on 2 2x4s and the composite board in between. So it was maybe an 18-inch by 24-inch section that had mold, and this mold remediation company wanted $1,800, and so I went to the seller, or the buyer had come to us with that, and I used my guy that I trust for mold remediation. He's licensed and certified, and I think it was $225. So prepare your clients. Mold remediation does not have to be expensive or scary. Square footage and boundary verification. This just states that unless you have a survey, the boundaries that are visible are going to be what the assumption is on the property lot, on the lot lines. And the square footage that is outlined in the MLS is approximate. If they want to know exact property lines, they're going to have to do a survey. If they want to know exact square footage, they're going to have to hire a professional. I always tell people, look, you can hire 3 professionals to come out and to get you an exact square footage. You're going to get 3 different numbers. So just know that the square footage is approximate. Seller's property condition disclosure. There's a section here that asks whether or not the buyer has seen it prior to submitting an offer. Just as a general rule, make sure that they have seen that form. You'll learn more about that in the seller's side contracts, but the seller's property condition disclosure form is gonna list any homeowners claims, homeowners insurance claims that have been filed, if there's been any mold on the property. At least that's what it's supposed to. Sellers are not always honest, but we are moving forward in our offer in good faith. So just it's a good idea to get your clients to take a look at that form prior to signing the purchase and sale agreement. Excuse me. The HOA, make sure that you're getting proper HOA information here. A lot of HOAs have started to charge statement of account fees, and it's usually $75 to $100 for them to print out a few pages of ink. But they're doing it, so make sure that your setup fee is correct, and that any property transfer fees are correct. I've been on the wrong end of that, where my clients told me, oh yeah, our HOA fee is this amount per month, and they were incorrect, and I had put that in the MLS that that's how much it was, and it was a material item to the buyer, and they were very close to their debt to income ratio. And when the actual HOA dues came out, it was going to make it so that they were no longer able to qualify. And so I personally had to, I didn't have to do anything, but I owed it to my clients to sell the property, and so I ended up paying the difference in the HOA for the next 2 years just out of my commission. It was only, I don't know what it was maybe $800. But it was a material thing to the buyer and to the underwriters, and so make sure that you're getting correct information. That way you don't end up on the hook or having the deal fall through. Section 19, this is cost. These are common closing costs and whose responsibility it is to pay them. So you'll want to make sure that you're filling this out properly. Most of these are up for negotiation. There are FHA and VA cheat sheets. However, a lot of those have changed and have become negotiable. So, but I'll give you kind of how I generally operate. The appraisal fee I usually put on the seller. They're trying to sell it for X amount of dollars. It's their responsibility to prove that it's worth that in the eyes of an appraiser. That's my thoughts. Sometimes buyers pay for them though. That can be a good negotiation tactic. An appraisal reinspection fee is not really commonly necessary, but I would put that on the buyer side. It's just a good compromise. Closing escrow fee is generally shared equally. Lender document processing fee, tax service fee, flood cert tracking fee, and lender required inspections, and attorney contract preparation or review fee, I always put as a buyer cost. Those are all buyer side items. So usually I put NA on attorney contract preparation. You're not going to really have an attorney involved, really, unless it's being purchased in a trust or something like that. Title insurance, standard coverage, owner's policy, that's going to be a seller fee. The mortgagee policy, that's a buyer fee because it's the lender that's requiring it. Additional title coverage, that's a buyer fee if they want it. And then for the next couple of items, like well potability, well productivity, septic, pumping, septic inspection, these things I always put on the seller side, and I put to be ordered by the seller. That way your buyer isn't having to go and order these things. Maybe they order one without giving a bid to the seller, and now the seller's on the hook, and they could have gotten it cheaper, or they don't like the company that does it. So just put that all on the seller. That's a good just general rule of thumb. Now directly beneath that, this is that section that they added where we no longer have to put in other terms and conditions that the seller is going to contribute X percentage of the purchase price towards the buyer's closing costs and or prepaid items. They finally added that to the contract underneath in section 19. So you'll just want to find out from the loan officer, hey, how much closing cost assistance do they need? And then you're going to put that in here. You're either going to put a percentage of the purchase price or a hard fixed dollar amount. So don't put both. And those fees are going to go towards covering their any closing fees that they might have, and those closing fees are outlined above. So you might put the seller is going to be paying 3% of the purchase price as a seller concession. But you're gonna have the closing escrow fee is shared equally, and lender doc process, all these are buyer's costs, additional title coverage, these are all buyer's costs, but those are still going to be covered by the seller in this 3%. So a good way to think about it is hey, these are the buyer's responsibility, but the seller is going to be paying for those on the buyer's behalf. Seller agrees to pay up to X amount of lender required repair costs. This would just be if you knew in advance that the roof needed to be replaced and that the seller or that the lender was going to catch it and they were going to say that it needed to be done. Or if there was a window that's broken and you know a VA appraiser is going to call that out, then you might just put in here $1,000, just enough to cover what you think they're going to need. Occupancy, whether or not they're going to occupy the property as their primary residence, this does need to be accurate. So really it's to help prevent mortgage fraud. If someone says they're going to be buying it as their primary residence, but they're not, they're going to be using it as an investment property, well, there's different mortgage rates for investment properties, and there's different terms for investment properties versus primary residences. So make sure that you're putting this accurate. Section 1031 tax deferred exchange. This just says if there is a 1031 exchange, like if the seller is doing it or the buyer is doing it, it will be at no cost to the other party.